we have a Home Secretary in place whose job it is to protect the country, but is engaged in a way where she's actually making the country and all of us less safe, is disturbing. And I think that as somebody from within the party, it is my responsibility and my duty. It's always easy as a politician to knock the opposition, right? That's the cut and thrust of politics. But what makes me a conservative is that, of course, I'm a loyal conservative, but before that, I am a loyal Brit. You know, what makes me patriotic is that I put my country's future above my party's future. And that's what every single conservative colleague should be doing. And if, you know, racist rhetoric and divisive campaigning wins us a few votes, that might be good for the Conservative Party, but that's bad for my country. And therefore, I think that I do have a duty and a responsibility to speak out, because we're damaging our country, but we're long-term, we're damaging our brand and our electoral prospects.
Sayeeda Warsi, hello. How's it going?
Hi, I'm well, thank you. And you?
Yes, not too bad, thank you. Thanks for taking the time to come on Politics, Joe. We're talking because several letters have been sent to the Prime Minister, one from the British Pakistan Foundation and another from a coalition of healthcare organisations regarding the Home Secretary Suella Braverman's recent remarks about child sexual exploitation, or grooming gangs as it's referred to in the media. First of all, for those not familiar, please could you set out what the Home Secretary said and then the significance of these letters in response?
Yeah, so there was a series of interviews which the Home Secretary has been doing over the last week or so, in which she's been talking about the sexual exploitation of children. And in that, without caveat, without explaining, without evidence, she's been talking about British Pakistani males and their cultural values.
What's clear is that what we've seen is a practice whereby vulnerable white English girls, sometimes in care, sometimes who are in challenging circumstances, being pursued and raped and drugged and harmed by gangs of British Pakistani men who've worked in child abuse rings or networks. We've seen institutions and state agencies, whether it's social workers, teachers, the police, turn a blind eye to these signs of abuse out of political correctness, out of fear of being called racist, out of fear of being called bigoted. And as a result, thousands, we're not talking small numbers, we're talking large numbers, thousands of children have had their childhoods robbed and devastated. And there are many of these perpetrators still running wild, behaving in this way.
And I think the letters are really quite significant and unprecedented, because the coalition of people who have written these letters, where effectively what they're saying to the Home Secretary is that your approach is one, racist rhetoric, and it's causing division. Secondly, it doesn't protect victims, which is what we hope that her job is to do. And thirdly, by saying that, look, you know, there's no evidence for the arguments that you're making. This coalition really is made up of medical professionals from British Indian communities, British Egyptian communities, British Ghanaian, Kenyan, nurses, surgeons, doctors, psychiatrists. And then the business community, entrepreneurs, financiers, accountants, lawyers. And what's interesting really about this group of people, who between them represent hundreds of thousands of individuals, is that they're not the kind of people who would normally engage in politics. And also interestingly for me as an ex-Conservative Party chairman, is they're the kind of people who would more likely than not vote Conservative, and would more likely than not even be Conservative donors. And I think that's what's so disappointing, that she's managed to align so many people against her and the government, not because of Conservative policy, but because of racist rhetoric. And it just seems like an odd way in which the Home Secretary chooses to do her job.
What do you think it speaks to, that broad coalition of people with the characteristics that you just mentioned? What do you think it speaks to, that they've been drawn out to engage politically in this way?
A lot of the signatories of these letters have been in touch with me personally over the last week, and I think the words that I heard over and over again was that this is dangerous, that we are fearful, that this is deliberately divisive, that this is electioneering, and that the safety of communities in our country is too serious an issue for it to be dealt with in this way. And I also heard from many people who are from communities which she didn't directly attack, but who were saying, well, you know, there but by the grace of God go I. You know, today it's one community, tomorrow it's another, and that we mustn't have a government and a Home Secretary who's prepared to play these divisive political game, but of kind of divide and rule, picking off communities, trying to pick winners and losers, and do so not because she's interested in the victims of sexual exploitation. And let's not forget, Ollie, we have tragically in this country, 500,000 children are sexually exploited every year. You know, just let those statistics sink in. 1 in 20 children in this country has been sexually abused or exploited in some way. And therefore, what should be at the forefront of the Home Secretary's mind is to find ways in which she can protect these children before these offences take place, rather than focusing on a subset of a subset of a subset of perpetrators who she's then using language to effectively absolve herself of responsibility for actually dealing with all victims and all perpetrators.
You mentioned in your previous answer the sort of lack of evidence to support the Home Secretary's claims. I mean, her own government department, the Home Office, published a report into this issue in 2020, and it found the majority of child sexual exploitation offenders are white, and also that despite some high-profile cases, links between ethnicity and these offences can't be proven. So it's not just a lack of evidence, there's actually evidence to the contrary. So why then do you think she said otherwise? What's her motivation?
I think this is what's most disturbing about her rhetoric, because, as you said, the 2020 Home Office report clearly showed that the overwhelming number of perpetrators of child sexual exploitation are white men, that there is no link between ethnicity except for these individual high-profile cases in certain cities. And even as recently as last year, there was a report published, the Linden report, which was an independent police investigation into the conduct of police during the time that these crimes were happening in Rotherham, which clearly showed that the police's approach towards these victims was not based on political correctness, but it was because they just didn't take these victims seriously, that many of them came from troubled families, many of them came from families that in the past had been known to the police, that there was this class issue. These girls were seen as dispensable. They were seen as having chosen these sexual lifestyle. Appalling conduct by the police. And the fact that the Home Secretary, who is responsible for the police, fails to hold the police accountable, fails to hold local authorities accountable for the fact that they simply did not protect these girls and did not take them seriously. But this is a lazy narrative from the Home Secretary to say, well, it's about British Pakistani males, and then the Prime Minister sadly has come in behind her, implicitly supporting those words by saying, and it was all to do with political correctness. I just think it's blatant electioneering. I think it's a government it's a Home Secretary that is unfortunately failing to do her job, and therefore it's much easier to rabble rouse and engage in racist rhetoric than to come up with solutions to protect our kids.
That's pretty damning. Very strong words from you there, and it's also it's quite telling because you've been chairperson of the Conservative Party in the past, and in one of your previous answers that you just gave, you said we can't have a government like this, we can't have a Home Secretary like this. I mean, these are pretty strong things, pretty out there things for someone who's been previously a leading figure, still is a leading figure, in the Conservative Party.
And it disturbs me, Ollie, because the Conservative Party that I joined was one of a one nation party, which existed in the centre ground, which was coming to terms with some of its historic issues around bigotry and racism, our issues in relation to homophobia, for example, of which I too hold myself responsible in being engaged in that space. And I think we learnt the lessons of that in the run up to the 2010 election. I think David Cameron created a different kind of Conservative Party. And it saddens me that I have colleagues now who are taking us back to those dark days of racist rhetoric and campaigning. This is bad for the country, but it's also politically bad for the Conservative Party. If you look at the list of signatories on these three letters, which is the reason why we're speaking today, they're people who are not engaged in politics. They're people who are, many of them, traditional Conservative voters. They're people who I know have in the past been Conservative donors. They've supported the Conservative Party. And the fact that these people now feel that their natural political home is starting to become a space which is divisive and racist, and we have a Home Secretary in place whose job it is to protect the country, but is engaged in a way where she's actually making the country and all of us less safe, is disturbing. And I think that as somebody from within the party, it is my responsibility and my duty. It's always easy as a politician to knock the opposition, right? That's the cut and thrust of politics. But what makes me a Conservative is that, of course, I'm a loyal Conservative, but before that, I am a loyal Brit. What makes me patriotic is that I put my country's future above my party's future. And that's what every single Conservative colleague should be doing. And if racist rhetoric and divisive campaigning wins us a few votes, that might be good for the Conservative Party, but that's bad for my country. And therefore, I think that I do have a duty and a responsibility to speak out, because we're damaging our country, but long-term, we're damaging our brand and our electoral prospects.
Can I pick up on something you said there? You're talking about damaging the country, and you also said that it makes it less safe. So could you talk a little bit more about the consequences of employing this kind of language? Does normalizing bigotry lead to violence?
It does, and we've seen recently when language again was used by the Home Secretary about migrants. We saw the attacks in Knowsley, and we saw the attacks in Dover, and also tragically when the terrorist in Christchurch in New Zealand walked into a place of worship and gunned down 51 innocent worshippers. One of the things that he had on his gun written was, "This is for Rotherham." So if you keep putting out this narrative that it is okay to kill innocent brown men or men of colour because they can all be tarnished with this brush, which is what the Home Secretary was doing. She was tarnishing a whole community. I think if she had over the weekend done interviews where she had been nuanced and she had basically said, the evidence shows X, or, there are certain very significant high-profile cases which were picked up by the media in these very significant small number of towns where the number of perpetrators came from a specific background. She didn't do any of that. I mean, she's now starting to backpedal, and she's starting to argue why what she was saying was correct, because what she's saying, well, what I'm saying is that based on a subset of a subset of a subset of a subset of perpetrators, what I'm saying is correct. But the damage has already been done. The fact that she's now starting to backpedal, if you go back to her interviews last weekend on Sunday and Monday, she was making none of those caveats or exceptions. She wasn't referring to any specifics. She just referred to British Pakistani males. And that includes, people we all recognize, Zayn Malik in, One Direction. It includes sports stars. It includes Adil Ray from Good Morning Britain and Citizen Khan. It includes my dad. It includes my husband. It includes my son. She didn't make any exceptions. She just brandished and demonized a whole community. And those words have consequences. We've seen that already play out. There was a grandfather in his 80s was killed on the streets of Rotherham because he was mistakenly targeted and called a groomer. And it just disturbs me that we have a Home Secretary who says things without thinking. One of the things that I've been trying to grapple with is this deliberate? you know, is this a deliberate election strategy? And she genuinely is a Trump tribute act, and she thinks that this is the way in which she wants to do elections. Or is she actually so incompetent that she cannot make policy based upon evidence and cannot find the skills to communicate things in a way which are measured and sensible and help to create good policy and good relations? But, you know, whether this is deliberate race baiting or whether this is incompetence, neither of them bode well to have a Home Secretary with those kind of challenges in such a high position.
I think one of the things that the Home Secretary said was that those men have values that aren't, talking about British Pakistani men, they have values that aren't compatible with British values. I mean, how does it make you feel to hear that? And I'd also sort of invite you to robustly reject that. I mean, hearing you talk about, you know, your husband, your son, those other people who are role models. I mean, it's farcical, isn't it, to suggest that those people don't share the same values, share British values?
I just think it's, you know, I'm one of 5 girls. You know, my father in his 80s still goes to work. He's, you know, he still goes out to work 5 days a week. He's a huge feminist. He's brought up these 5 incredibly independent, open-minded, you know, successful young women. He's worked hard all his life. You know, he's paid his taxes. I come from a family of 2 grandfathers, you know, British Pakistani males who served in the British Indian Army and who were prepared to give their lives for this country. I did not think that in 2023 we would have a Home Secretary, tragically a Home Secretary who is also another woman of colour, putting out this terrible rhetoric, which effectively is undermining so much that so many people do. When I was speaking to some of the signatories of these letters, Ollie, one of the guys said, you know, I was an accountant before last weekend. I'm now apparently a paedophile, you know, and this is the way he sees it. He says, I actually felt that I was having conversations in my office in a way that I'd never experienced before. You know, people are talking about being fearful, about being scared of the consequences. We're having conversations with our boys, you know, our grown-up boys, to say, when you go out, just be careful where you go, be careful where, you know, who you're hanging out with. We should not be having these conversations in our country. We should not have a government and a Home Secretary who creates a climate that ordinary law-abiding people in this country suddenly start to feel fearful and start looking over their shoulder and start feeling like they don't belong. And I just think it's not the way that, you know, politics should be done in the United Kingdom. I know there's a tradition of it, you know, in Trump's Republican Party, but we cannot become that. We should not become that. And I genuinely hope that she takes time to consider what she says, and she retracts, you know, her dangerous statements, and she goes back to making policy based upon evidence and fact.
Baroness Warsi, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.